model. Could you elaborate on what that would look like under Labour?
Well, look, I mean, clearly our reputation is lying in shreds all over the world. I mean, Liz Truss said in 2019 that she was going to make a trade agreement with the United States her number one priority. In 2020, she said that she was making good progress. Here we are in 2022, and the prospect of a trade deal, she's had to admit, is as remote as ever. Why? Because of the protocol bill and huge concerns across Republicans and Democrats about the way it undermines the Good Friday Agreement. I find it perplexing that you would ever describe the French as our foe or enemy when clearly they are our closest allies. And look, if you want to build a coalition of countries, and let's be clear, if you look at the votes in the United Nations on Ukraine, there are sensitivities in the global south. There's a persuasion point for countries that have traditionally been non-aligned in the G7, 77, when clearly if malaria is still taking as many lives globally, why would you cut the funding on malaria? If the biggest killer in India is TB, why would you cut the funding for TB? If the biggest issue in the continent of Africa is HIV, why would you cut the funding? So of course our reputation is in tatters as I speak to countries across the world. And of course, Jacob Rees-Mogg, promoted. This does not fill the global community, particularly so many small island states. You know, the bulk of the Commonwealth are small island states. They're really powering on issues of climate change. This does not fill them with hope for where the UK is internationally. On international development, not only am I concerned about our attitude to the Global Fund, I'm also and our 0.7, I think it's of real concern that it looks like the government have raided the aid budget to meet the needs, understandably, of refugees fleeing and seeking haven in our country. That clearly should be coming out of the Home Office. It's coming out of the aid budget, which means that the aid budget loses a further $3 billion. This is really, really, really worrying. What we've said is that we are absolutely committed to a new model for development. We say that because I think it's a bit knee-jerk just to say that we're going to reinvent DFID. DFID was the right arrangement in 1997. It was trailblazing. We must find the right arrangement for 2021 in a vastly changed world. Why do I say the world's vastly changed? Well, for example, the biggest lender to much of the global south at the moment is no longer the World Bank and the IMF, it's China. We're facing a pandemic, a food shortage. The biggest emergency is actually climate. And it's why I've said yesterday, and will repeat tomorrow, that we want to make the climate emergency the fourth pillar of the United Nations Charter. We want to use our role on the Security Council to achieve that. I believe powerfully that the Labour Party should stand up and say that we support ecocide and dealing with either companies or countries that are prepared to cause such devastation, not just in their own countries, but to the planet. And I think there's huge concerns about what's happened in the Amazon. But also, when I say a new model, it's because, you know, when I came into this job in November, I remember at that stage, people were raising alarm about the fact that the global community had failed to secure sufficient vaccines for the global south. Percentage rates in some African countries of just a first vaccine was running at about 4-8% at that stage. Abysmal. But for me, and I've raised issues around development before, historically, These are not new issues to me. To me, the issues was not solely about how do we vaccinate the global south, how do we vaccinate the continent of Africa. It was a deeper question. Why have we not used science and innovation in the sixth richest economy in the world? We've got some of the best scientists in the global community to help the continent of Africa have its own manufacturing capacity. That is the fundamental question. And if we are to have a new model, we have to be able to answer those questions as well. It cannot be just the old-fashioned conversation about aid. And our populations increasingly require us to be enablers as well as those who are assisting. So we've got to make a distinction between humanitarian aid, I think, and development aid, and how development is really working in the 21st century. So when I talk about a new model, it's because we recognise that there are different models globally, and we want to be at the forefront of this agenda.
You know, last time we met, you and Preet were planning a visit to Afghanistan. You've now been on that visit there. What do you think the future holds for Afghanistan from being there firsthand, and what role should the UK play?
Well, can I first pay tribute to my colleague Preet Gill, who's doing a tremendous job holding the government to account, despite the fact that the which bit of FCDO, which minister is responsible for aid, if anyone is at all, keeps moving around. It was wonderful to go to Afghanistan with Preet. I say wonderful because it was important that we were the first Western politicians from a G7 country to return to Afghanistan. I felt very, very strongly that the news cycle had moved on in our country to Ukraine, and Afghanistan had fallen off the news cycle, and we could do what I knew we could do. We took the Guardian with us to draw attention back to the situation of Afghanistan, the botched departure by our country, remind people of the way it was handled by Dominic Raab and others, but more importantly, of the situation that the Afghans find themselves in. And I'm afraid it was very, very bleak. Bleak because people forget that it's a country that's experienced famine and drought even before the exit. And it was a very tough winter indeed. We went to a maternity hospital where I saw children really perishing in front of our eyes. It was so desperate. But worse of all, frankly, and I spent a lot of the time with tears running down my eyes, was the time I spent with women and girls in Afghanistan. I'm hugely grateful to the United Nations and their agencies for all that they're doing and the way that they assisted me on that visit. But it is heartrending to sit with women who were studying medicine just 2 years ago, young girls, 17, 18, for whom the shutter came down, literally, and they are stuck in their homes. It was really very, very sad to be with people that helped our country, assisted our country, stuck in Kabul, hiding effectively because they're worried for their lives, sitting with older women who are facing such extreme poverty beyond Kabul, coming down though to see me. One told a story of being forced to have to decide whether she was going to sell her kidney to put food on the table. I'm fortunate in my 22 years in politics to have been to some pretty challenging environments. I remember a trip I made to the Congo a few years ago, to Sierra Leone just after the conflict, to Rwanda just after conflict, to Haiti, which sadly is in a troubled state again at the moment. But what I saw in Afghanistan was very, very, very alarming. And there was a powerful sense in which the international community has walked away. And that was my real concern.
Can I ask you if you can come in a bit so we could try and get as many people in as possible, because there's a lot of people waiting back there. If you could filter around, we should be able to fit more of you in. On a positive line, I want to take us forward to, we've had a general election, Labour have won a landslide. You're coming in as the government's foreign secretary. What do you do week one? What are your priorities? And crucially, you've touched on this a bit already, but what would we see change from a Conservative foreign policy?
Well, a European colleague said to me that it would feel like rain on a desert. Look, I think that we will be multilateralists. Clearly, I will be very busy visiting a lot of places in those initial weeks. We would see a return to our fundamental commitment on our belief in a rule of law and human rights. We would be values-based in the way that we approached foreign policy. We would be working hand in hand with our sister parties in the United States, in Germany, in Australia, to make the world a better place. We would be using our leverage as best we can on the Security Council. It would be a normalising approach to our relationships around the world. I think there would be a sense that Britain is back at the table, because I get a sense that we're frequently not at the table. I'd want to emphasise there would be no change on Ukraine. That has not been a partisan issue. We've not sought to make it a partisan issue. We stand firmly with the people of Ukraine fighting Putin's aggression, very, very definitely. But I do think that the government has been weak at dealing with dirty money in our country. There's more to do there, and Labour's absolutely clear. This is not just dirty money from Russia. It's dirty money from lots of places in the world where there are authoritarians and despots washing their money through London as a capital city. And second, as I've said, you undermine your efforts in Ukraine if you are treating the global south in the shabby way that we're seeing on international development, because people claim hypocrisy. And we understand in our party, this is the party that stood with black South Africans against apartheid. This is the party that stood with Ugandan Asians against Idi Amin. This is the party that stood with Vietnamese boat people when they were fleeing conflict and hardship in Vietnam. And we, of course, will be the party that you would expect to raise our voice at what's happening in Ethiopia, what's happening in Yemen. We're very concerned about the arms that are being sold in order to cause such pain and hardship in the Yemen. Syria. There are conflicts around the world. We're living in new, multipolar, challenging times. We have to be present, and clearly the emergence of China as well presents some real challenges. So this is a period of multilateralism where we have to hang together with countries that believe in those values that emerged after the Second World War, an ordered-based approach to the world's global problems, always looking for peace and negotiating our way out of those problems, but definitely defenders of human rights, defenders of the rule of law, and a values-based approach to our democracies.
Right, now if you have... Yes, that's where the answer. Right, if you have a question for David, if you could put your hand up, and Layla will come to you with the microphone, and if you could state your name and your question, and I'm going to take them in batches of 2 so we can try and get through as many as possible. Pimana, if we come to you first and then David.
Hi, I'm Pimana Assad, the co-founder and co-chair of the Labour Foreign Policy Group. My question is on Afghanistan. I was at an Islamic relief event just this afternoon, and there wasn't that many people in the audience. So clearly there isn't that much interest from within the Labour Party on the issue of Afghanistan. You mentioned it, and you said that you went and visited, and you wanted to bring global attention to the issue. My question is on the Afghan central bank reserves that are currently frozen in the United States. the United States have set up a new mechanism called the Afghan Fund, where they're going to distribute 3 million of that money through the NGO sector into to help the humanitarian situation in the country. What would Labour's position be if Labour was in government the next time on how they would interact with the issue of the frozen central bank reserves, and would we take the side of the US on that, because that is, in itself is quite controversial to some people inside Afghanistan? Thank you.
Okay. We'll do David next.
Thanks very much, David, and I want to start by saying thank you for your decision announced by Keir early in the summer to bring back a Department for International Development. I know that it was something that we wanted to hear at the Labour Campaign for International Development, that Labour members and supporters of charities around the country would have loved to have heard, so thank you for that. But my question was actually around Ukraine and what it means for other conflicts around the world, because there's clearly been a fantastic response to the fascist invasion by Putin of Ukraine. How can we ensure that we respond robustly to other incidents around the world in Syria and Yemen and other conflicts that are yet to break out to help protect civilians from mass atrocity and genocide?
Thank you. So we've got one on frozen reserves in Afghanistan and one on Ukraine.
The frozen reserve, the frozen reserve issue is complicated, problematic. I'm glad there's been some progress. We did meet with representatives from the World Bank that were trying to unlock that situation with the United States. Things have moved on since then. I've got a feeling things will have moved on a bit by the time that there's a next general election. I did pick up, obviously, concerns within the country about the huge problems of cash, adding to the problems of poverty and the real economy in the country, and also how you deal with the context of the Taliban, picking up the nuances, which is that actually there are regional variations, there are generational variations amongst the Taliban, and there may be ways in which G7 countries can be engaged in Afghanistan without the kind of complete shutters that have been pulled down at the moment. So I suspect we'll inherit a different situation. I don't want to wade into the complexities of the US position on that fund, but I will keep a watching eye. Look, I think that we're seeing that the decision to abolish DFID has had some consequences. And, you know, I worry quite a lot of the concerns that are being raised with me by countries far and wide in Asia, in Africa, about Ukraine and its consequences for them. What do they mean by that? Well, they mean, well, look, if inflation is soaring in the UK, if you're in for a tough winter in Europe, can you imagine what it means for countries where food prices can lead to riots and can lead to serious conflict and democratic instability? And that's why this is a time for the UK to be really judicious and to be clear about the words that we're seeing at the Labour conference this year. Fairer and greener. You know, what does fairer really mean? That does mean understanding conflicts as they range across the globe to maintain that coalition of interest as we face down despots and authoritarian wherever they're found. We're living in times where democracy is on the way. There are now less democracies in the world than there were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And as my friend David Miliband has put so well, we're also living in an age of impunity. And, you know, we need a Labour government because we need to challenge that age of impunity.
We have a question over here, Claudia, the bottom one there, and then a question for Richard.
Hi there, Claudia from International Rescue Committee. Thank you for quoting the big boss, David Miliband. Your colleague earlier, Preet, was speaking about the fact that a feminist approach to international development policy is still very much part of her agenda. I wondered what parts of a feminist foreign policy you might plan to include in a Labour government, and specifically how you would envisage your government working with and funding local and women-led CSOs. And on top of that, you mentioned the importance of ensuring that our aid budget is used efficiently. And I wanted to ask if a Labour government would commit to spending 50% of ODA in fragile and conflict-affected states such as Afghanistan, Ethiopia and Yemen. Thank you.
Then to Richard there.
Thanks. Richard Darlington. I was lucky enough to work at DFID under a Labour government, and so I want to add my thanks as well for the fact that you're going to bring DFID back.
We said we're committed to a new model. We can't just reinvent what was there before.
Yeah.
Can I just say this in very strong terms? I know that the aid sector deeply wants DFID back. You have to accept it has gone, and that what we don't want from a Labour government is massive inertia, because we come to office, we reconfigure quickly, and we're not able to do anything because all of our officials are busy sorting themselves out. So it is not a commitment to re-bring back DFID. Very sadly, the Tories ruined it. It is a commitment for a new model that fits for the 21st century, allow us to be innovative, and I'm very keen to listen to the sector on how that innovation should work 2027. This is not 1997, and we should be more ambitious than recreating 1997. I'm clear about that, Preet is clear about that, Keir is clear about that. So it's not as simple, I want to say this in categorical terms, of bringing back DFID. They should never have got rid of it, but on the basis that they have got rid of it, let us look at the world's challenges as they are today. And the world today is hugely different to the world in 1997. In 1997, Labour was leading the charge, and Gordon and Tony on the Millennium Goals, what then became the Sustainability Goals. We had a whole coalition of interests. The country was crying out for that. We're in a different time now. We're in a cost of living crisis domestically. The climate emergency is huge. Some governments make climate the centre of their international development. So when I say a new model, I mean it. That's what we're looking for. Help us develop what that is. Sorry to cut.
No, I think you might have gone on to answer my question, actually, because I was going to say that I saw Douglas Alexander work really closely with the then Foreign Secretary, David Miliband. I also saw him work very closely with the then Climate Change Secretary, his brother, Ed Miliband, in the run-up to the 2009 COP in Copenhagen, which was so disappointing. So I just wanted to, again, say that I thought that your piece in The Independent the weekend, the fact that you want to put climate change at the heart of that, both development and diplomatic agenda, is really important. So I think you answered my question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
One on a feminist foreign policy and one on climate.
Look, it's very sad that under Liz Truss's period as Foreign Secretary, we really haven't seen a feminist foreign policy in the way that's required, and the hardship I saw in Afghanistan is testimony to that. I've had representations around water and the huge contribution we made to access to clean water in our time in government. Hugely affects the lives of women, we know, across the global south, is really important. I'm not going to make a financial commitment because you'll find that I'm a bit more disciplined than that. The Labour Party has moved on from the days where we just knee-jerk financial commitments. And we have seriously got to see what we inherit. It looks very likely that the election now is not going to come quickly. It's going to be into 2024. So let's see what we inherit. But I, just understand also that my family are from the country of Guyana. Guyana has traditionally been, in that part of the world, the second poorest country in the region after Haiti. Now, there has been a new discovery of oil that's changed the fortune of that country with all the downsides that oil brings, particularly to countries in South Latin America. But what I'm thinking of when I think of a feminist foreign policy is the way that women in every village I know are at the centre of whether that community is working, functioning or not. They are at the centre where there is abuse. You know, one of the issues that was coming up in Afghanistan is violence and abuse in times of hardship as well. And that's why you've got to be serious about a feminist foreign policy, and it's something that Preet is prosecuting and litigating very, very well within our team, and you'll hear more about.
If I could see the women at the front here, and then the gentleman there, blue jacket.
Thank you. Good afternoon, David. My name's Nikki. My question was with regards to the lockdown and the epidemic, whether that has brought about any learnings or considerations in terms of our foreign policy.
Can you say a bit more about that? What do you mean by that?
So in terms of how the whole world could cooperate to go into a lockdown, does that give us a hope as to better collaboration between nations, or are we back to things as normal post-lockdowns?
James Bolton-Jones from the charity Spotlight on Corruption. You put a very welcome emphasis on the dirty money that's been washing through London from authoritarian regimes, etc. I was wondering how a Labour government would build in anti-corruption into its foreign policy. Thanks.
Thank you. So one on lockdown and global collaboration, and then one on anti-corruption.
I think there are very big questions that come out of the experience of the pandemic. I think it would be, I mean, it's the role that the World Health Organization played is crucial and important, but I'm afraid I don't think that the pandemic was the best example of cooperation across the globe, or we wouldn't have been in the situation with the vaccine that we saw in much of the global south. Having said that, what I think the pandemic also demonstrated, and this is getting into how it's likely that the pandemic arose and when we affect nature and climate, the consequences of that really ought to have woken the world up to the huge urgency of the climate emergency. Let's see the analysis that comes out of the World Health Organization into how we dealt with the pandemic in terms of lockdowns. There are different assessments of the effectiveness of that. I remember when I came into the role in November, the truth was there were some differences of opinion in Africa particularly about the pandemic, i.e. it was the case in Western democracies like our own that we were seeing elderly populations hugely affected. Of course, in much of the global south, they're much younger populations, and the truth is it wasn't just COVID, it was malaria, TB, HIV, capacity to vaccinate on a whole range of issues and systems. And that's what we were hearing from a lot of leaders in terms of how they were balancing their priorities. And we have to take that learning and understand that learning. But I think we've probably got some way to truly understand the implications of what the pandemic said and presented to us.
But then there was one on anti-corruption.
Look, there are still significant problems at Companies House where you can register a company for 12 quid and it can be a dummy company and we know nothing about it. We would reform that straight away. I think there are big problems in Britain with enforcement against corruption. I think we've seen some issues still with some of our Crown dependencies and transparency and accountability in relation to that. There's been a lot of concentration on sanctions against Russia, but we know, don't we, that there is dirty money flowing into London from other despots, authoritarian states. It finances, by the way, it's not just money laundering, it finances often drugs, guns, the trafficking of women and girls, and it's happening before our eyes, and very little is being done about it. The National Crime Agency needs the capacity to better deal with this as well. So there's a lot to do. We would implement in full the Russia report, which we haven't seen this government do. We would fix some of the problems that we're seeing of money washing into the political system, effectively from overseas, either through oligarchs present in our own country or through these dummy companies that then finance political parties. All of it has to be cleaned up, and we're really serious about that.
We'll go to the two gentlemen over there.
Hi there, George Grills from The Times. You talked about Britain's reputation lying in shreds. What's your reaction to the collapse in the pound that we saw this morning? And to what extent do you think the lingering after effect of Brexit continues to harm Britain's reputation internationally?
Well, look, I think the collapse of the pound speaks for itself, doesn't it? Very sadly, I think probably the Kwasi Kwarteng should stop giving interviews, because every interview he gives seems to make the situation worse. So that's my advice to him. I'm not keen to talk down our economy, but they have made dramatic decisions last week in their mini budget that it's clear the global community do not understand and weaken our economy, don't strengthen it in the medium to long term. There are a number of effects structurally underlying the British economy. Productivity is at the heart of it, and clearly British businesses are recovering from a period of pandemic, and they are recovering with trade being down in Europe 30%. Our exports are down. So there are some significant structural issues that you've got to deal with. You need a proper industrial policy. You've got to invest in skills. You don't need a trickle-down economy. You need a build-up economy where you're building from bottom up. It's why, by the way, taking away money in universal credit, the £20 that they took away from the poorest in society, was a big mistake.
Hi. Hello. Yeah, thanks for that. My name's Shahid Mushtaq. I'm a councillor in Oldham. Just going back to the Ukraine-Russia war, I mean, at the beginning, there was talk of, obviously, World War III, and with Putin now threatening nuclear weapons, that's come to the fore again. What I was thinking is there are a number of large countries that have not condemned. So, God forbid World War III was to happen, obviously, you start thinking allies and would be on one side and the other. So that part of it worries me, and for me, we have lots of discussions about Islamophobia in Oldham and beyond. But I've been thinking about it, and it feels to me like the types of movements that are taking place, the issue, especially in Europe, with the success of far-right politics, including Italy, as we've seen today, the issue is liberalism, it feels like, with some of those parties describing themselves proudly as illiberal. So that would then create a bit of an issue within Europe as well. Do you feel that liberalism is now becoming a major issue that's driving some of what's happening around the world, and how much of a threat do you think that is, if it indeed is?
Well, I gave a long speech on this subject, which is available on the web at Tufts University earlier in the year, and I'd direct you to that speech in more depth. What I saw actually last week in New York was the international community really recoiling from the threats that were being made by Putin. They can see that this referendum is a sham referendum and wholly in breach of international law. They were alarmed, frankly, by the references that he made to nuclear. I thought it was interesting that President Modi, Prime Minister Modi, seemed to indicate He said that this is not the time for war. And actually the Chinese have talked about a negotiated peace just in the last few days. So I think that the international community response to what they saw from Putin last week has been pretty unified in deep concern about what's now happening. And you're beginning to see Russian people, where they can, voting with their feet and choosing to leave. And so we must do all we can to maintain the coalition, to stand up to this aggression. And I'm really clear. My ancestors know a little bit about what imperialism looks like. And what we're seeing from Putin is a new imperialism. And we've got to stand up to it.
Go to two gentlemen there in the middle, if you and you.
Hi, I'm Lee Crawford from the Centre for Global Development. Just on the issue of an independent ministry department for international development, I used to hear all the time from colleagues that DFID was the best aid agency in the world. And I think the opportunity for something new is that we know that there are so many other policies beyond aid that really matter for development. Take whether it's dirty money, or whether it's investing in vaccines, whether it's migration, or taking more refugees, really pulling our weight in a way that we don't there. Improving trade policies, reducing arms exports to despotic regimes. It'd be great to hear what your priorities would be for improving some of those beyond aid policies for global development.
If you could hand to the gentleman to your right. Yes.
I think you started to encroach on my question, but my question was going to be around what, in Labour's foreign policy vision, that unique Britain-shaped whole in global leadership will look like. So you started to kind of shape those contours around leveraging on science, a new model for DFID, and climate as being an important thing. So what are those unique things that you feel this country can lead on and will define a unique Labour vision?
That's a very good question. Look, on the first question, I'm afraid I can't set that out now. That needs a whole other speech. And Christian Aid asked me recently to give a speech that was delayed because of the Queen's passing that will be rescheduled. So there's a moment coming up where I can go into a little bit more detail about that. And I don't want to pull the thunder from Christian Aid, which is an NGO I've always supported and had a long association with. On the second point, Britain's uniqueness, I think, is a really, really good question and very important. We have a place on the United Nations Security Council. We have tremendous leverage on issues now like the climate emergency. When people talk about the role that DFID played going back to 1997 and through the noughties, what they're really talking about in the end is the alleviation of poverty around the world, lifting the contribution to lifting millions of children out of poverty, being at the forefront of getting girls to school and into education. And as I say, building that fund, dealing with the health, big killers, TB, malaria, and HIV. And I think that there's still an agenda, and the sustainability goals underlie that, in all of those areas. But we must keep climate at the centre, which is what I've been outlining over the course of this conference. And I think we've got to use our flexibility to be a bit more innovative in the development space particularly. I've historically raised issues sometimes about old-fashioned tropes that get churned out in the international development community. And I stand by some of those tropes, some of the inappropriate advertising and the infantilizing of whole continents and people. I feel that very, very strongly. And there will be some NGOs that are still guilty of that in this room. And so when I say that I want to be in a more innovative place, I want to be in a place of partnership, I want to be in a place that recognizes the concerns that the Global South express in this new age of post-colonialism. I think it's really important to recognize those things and innovate. I have no doubt that the UK can be at the forefront of that in a way that other countries might struggle. And I think that's very exciting. That's very, very exciting for us. And in a sense, over the last week, as we've heard the way in which the royal family have been innovators, actually, on issues like climate, issues like moving out of that period in the 1950s to a voluntary association of Commonwealth countries. When you meet the most effective prime ministers, like the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, really motoring on the global scene about the challenges to island economies from climate, you recognise the power that the UK could have if we lean towards these trends and these issues that are emerging in the global community, recognising that when the Global South is as indebted to China as they are, a country that does not share all of our values, seems hell-bent on creating a different world order, not the settled world order that we had after the Second World War. You recognise why we need to be fleet of foot in the way that we renew and strengthen these multilateral partnerships across the globe.
I'll take our final two questions now. The gentleman just there, and then I'll go for there. And we'll sneak in a third one here.
Thank you very much. David, sorry, my name's George Byrne from London. When you become Foreign Secretary in the not too distant future, we all hope, what will your priorities, what will be the features of the relationship with India in general terms? And more specifically, even before you become Foreign Secretary, do you advocate the repatriation of the Koh-i-Noor diamond ahead of Charles III's coronation?
And Layla, it's just over here. There were two. This gentleman with the glasses here, and then the front.
Hi, so I was at the International Development meeting last night with Preet Gill, and she said something that I loved. She said that local health is global health, and I'm Sanjesh Dalmia, by the way, from Scientists for Labour, and I think that's a really important issue when it comes to preventing future pandemics. So I don't think this government takes the idea seriously. If you look at the contributions they've given to the World Bank's pandemic fund, they've been very low, especially looking at as a percentage of GDP compared to other countries and what they've contributed. So I'd like to ask whether Labour would look to contribute more to the World Bank's pandemic fund, whether they'd look to contribute more to the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness, and to do this to guarantee Britain's security from pandemics, and to show global leadership on this issue alongside climate change.
Then they were just at the front here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mukhtar Yusuf. I'm a councillor in Barking and Dagenham. My question relates to the Ukraine crisis, how that has caused massive food shortages, predominantly across the developing countries. I believe that 352 million people are in severe crisis of I believe 82 countries. How would Labour be dealing with this issue once you come into power?
Look, it has been important to deal with the issue of the blockade on Odessa. It's why we've got to keep supporting the Ukrainians, because if there were a blockade again, the situation would be even worse. But it's also why, and it goes to your question, if you look at the strategy that Liz Truss published on international development, What she wants to pursue is more bilateralism, and we disagree with her. We actually think that multilateralism and funds like the pandemic are indicative. You get more bang for your buck, basically, if Britain is in partnership globally. So we disagree with the direction of travel on that. That's how you deal with some of the problems that are emerging. I mean, I think, I don't want to, I'm in danger of repeating myself, the issues that many countries in the global south are facing are desperate and worrying, and will lead, to loss of life, is the truth, and to major conflict. And that's why the sort of stepping away from international aid is not in, clearly it's not in those countries' interests, but it's not in our own interests either, is the truth. India is an important democracy. There are lots of democracies in the world. We were talking about Italy a moment ago, where they're not my natural allies, but nevertheless it's an important democracy, and it's a very important country for us to be engaged with, and the UK to be engaged with. There are long-standing issues, for example, like Kashmir, where we need to work with India and Pakistan on one of the world's longest-running problems. India is an important country. I've visited it on many, many times, and I'm very proud of the fact that my grandmother was Indo-Guyanese and from Calcutta, so I have some fondness for the Indian subcontinent. I think we'll end there.
Yeah, great. Well, that's
Thank you
all
very
we have
much.
time for. It's a huge thank you, David. Also, I thank everyone who asked questions, our co-hosts, and a special thank you to Layla and the CTP team for organising today.